Rabbi,
chapter 9. Yeah.
I got a general question.
Yes.
Is it correct that we don't hold by the Gemara, we hold by the Shulchan Aruch? Because it's very confusing to get one thing to the other. So what would we hold by?
Well, depends what you mean hold by. Now, Shulchan Aruch is going to be the conclusion, but it's going to come from the Gemara. Meaning, so sometimes in the Gemara you might have more than one view, or there could be perhaps different interpretations of a statement in the Gemara, and Shulchan Aruch is going to be the decider. So that was really the purpose of the Shulchan Aruch. So actually, I mean, since you've asked, maybe we'll have a quick run through. So, I mean, we were going to have the Siyam and start a new topic, but we're not in the rush to start a new topic. So if we have a good question, maybe we'll take advantage. So first of all, what is Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, you know, and all of these things? So we know what happened on Mount Sinai. Hashem gave Moshe all the mitzvahs, right? He didn't, you know, we say that he gave him the Torah. He didn't give him the Torah word for word as we have it. I mean, he did give it to Moshe, but not at Har Sinai, not at Mount Sinai, right? Because as we see, there are parts of it that were written after Mount Sinai, right? Throughout the 40 years, there was a gap, was a period of time where Moshe did not have a revelation from Hashem, but we'll say, loosely speaking, over the 40 years, there was a continuous revelation, and the Torah that we have today, we can say was the final wording was finalized pretty much the week of Moshe's passing, which would have been, you know, a few months short of 40 years after the revelation of Mount Sinai. But on Mount Sinai, we got all the mitzvahs. Now, although we got all the mitzvahs, we definitely got all the mitzvahs. It's not clear as to whether did we get every detail of the mitzvahs, of each mitzvah on Mount Sinai, or do we just get the general principles and the details were filled out over the 40 years? But either way you're going to look at it, all the details were given to Moshe at some time throughout the 40 years in the wilderness. Now, what happened was like this. Hashem dictated to the Torah to Moshe one paragraph at a time. So if you look in a Sefer Torah, you'll see these little paragraphs. Now, the paragraphs sometimes have a like a line and a half empty, or the rest of the line empty, or there can be a gap in the middle of the line. But these in these paragraphs, Hashem dictated to Moshe one paragraph at a time. Then after he dictated it to him, he taught it to him. So let's just use simple examples. The mitzvah of a mezuzah. So in the written Torah, in the dictated word for word, it says, and you shall write them on your doorposts. What's them? It doesn't say what them are. So after Hashem finished dictating the paragraph to Moshe, Hashem gave Moshe a shir, gave him a lesson. Said, you know what them are? It's what we now call a mezuzah, and here are all the laws to make a kosher mezuzah. And just if you're curious, there's over 3,000 laws to make a kosher mezuzah. Nothing to it. Right? So so Hashem gave Moshe a shir, and we're told, you know what the gaps between the paragraphs represent, amongst other things? That's Moshe was doing a review. Right after he got the shir of all the details, he reviewed it. And the great commentator Rashi points out, if when God is the teacher and Moshe Rabbeinu, the great Moses, is the student, you have to review your learning to make sure you understand it properly. So how much more so when the teacher is a regular human and we're the students? how much more so we have to review everything we learn. So that's just a side point there. So what happened was initially, Moshe then taught each year he got received from Hashem, each lesson he received from Hashem, he taught to Aaron. Then Aaron stepped aside, and while Aaron was listening, Moshe taught it to Aaron's sons. And then they stepped aside, and Aaron and his sons still listened. And then he taught the Sanhedrin, the sages, right? And then eventually he taught everybody. So Moshe taught it quite a few times. Now Aaron then repeated the shir to his sons. Now his sons had already heard it 3 times from Moshe. So if he would make a mistake, they pick it up. Right? Then Aaron taught it to everyone. Then Aaron's sons taught it to everyone. And the sages taught it to everyone. So everyone got to hear it multiple times directly, initially, I should say, and everyone heard it at least once from Moshe directly. Now, all of these details are called Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah. So we have the written Torah, that's we'll say the 5 books of Moses. And then we have the written Torah, which are all these extra details and explanations. And they're both from Hashem, if not directly on Mount Sinai, then throughout the duration of the 40 years in the wilderness. So Hashem told it to Moshe, he dictated the written Torah, and then he gave a shir, gave a lesson on that paragraph in the written Torah, the Torah Sab, written Torah, and that explanation on multiple levels is called Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah. So essentially we have 2. Now, for quite a while, meaning for over 1,500 years, the oral Torah stayed oral. Now, a few problems happened. Well, before we get to the problems why we had to write it down, let's talk about how it was retained. So people who are misguided or have an agenda that they wish to undermine the teachings of Torah, they try to imply that the oral tradition, the game, the kids play the broken telephone, you whisper something in one's ear and they whisper the next person. So they try to imply that that's what the transmission of the oral tradition was, and God forbid, therefore, you can't rely on it. Now, that's not true for a variety of reasons. Number one is, how do you get confusion in the game of broken telephone? Is A, you only whisper it in the person's ear. 2, you can't repeat it. And 3, they can't ask any clarification. Now, when the oral Torah was transmitted, it was repeated many times. And as a matter of fact, the standard practice was for a student to review everything that they learned 100 times. And they could ask their questions to their teachers. And, although it's possible that a young man could start to learn from a great teacher at the end of his life, and they only have a little bit of time together, but usually what happens is you have a young student, let's say in the 20s, and he comes to a middle-aged teacher, and they overlap by many years. And if the student will make an incorrect ruling, his teacher is available to correct him. He's available to confer with, to hopefully get the correct ruling, etc. So it was very thoroughly taught, and it was handed down. And to become a halachic authority, you had to pass a test. And this test, you got an ordination called smicha. Now, today, we call a rabbi's ordination smicha. It's a borrowed term from this smicha. This smicha we're talking about, unfortunately, died out. But what happened was Hashem ordained Moshe. And in last week's Pasha, Moshe ordained or gave the authority to 72 people. And once the Jews entered the land of Israel, this ordination could only be given in the land of Israel by someone who had it to someone who deserved it. And, this ordination is really on the entire oral tradition, the entire Torah Shabbat Peh, the entire oral Torah. And the person was able essentially to grasp all of it. In the regular people, grasp all of it. Now, you might ask, how can we do that? Seems like we need a photographic memory. So there's the Talmud tells us in Sanhedrin, and if I would have known someone's going to ask the question, I might have looked it up to recall exactly which page. But when the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, there were 10 changes made to the world. So for an example, one of the changes, the sky changed color, it was a different shade of blue. But one of the changes was our das, we're going to loosely translate as our knowledge part of our intellect, what helps us know things, was concealed. Now, people, it's commonly known that when it comes to processing, we only use a small percentage of our brain. Now, we use a lot of our brain for different tasks. When it comes to processing information, we only use a small part of our brain. And people might wonder why. So our tradition tells us that people had access to it before the destruction of the first Beis Mikdash. And it wasn't taken away, it was just concealed. And we still have it, just it's not being accessed when it comes to processing. So what used to happen was essentially the oral Torah, what we would call the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, people mastered at a very young age. And in the yeshivas, instead of studying Talmud and Halacha, they studied prophecy. They studied the ability to become a prophet. And so we see throughout the books of the prophets, we keep encountering people, the B'nai Nevi'im, literally the children of the prophets, but it means the students. And so they would come to various places, Leo, Elisha, and as they came to various places, there were groups of students that came out to meet them. And they were all studying to have prophecy. And again, the Talmud tells us that there were as many prophets amongst the Jewish people as there were Jews who left Egypt. Now, in good Talmudic fashion, that could mean two things. It could mean the amount of people that were counted, so 600,000, just over 600,000. Or it could mean all the Jews came out of Egypt, because we know that only the men aged between 20 and 60, those who were eligible to go into the army, were counted. So you had all the men over 60, all the women 20 to 60 and older than 60, and all the children. So most likely closer to around 3 million. So there might have been over 3 million prophets, or there might have been just a little more than 600,000. Either way, it's a big number, right? There are a lot of prophets. So tangent on this tangent, in the Tanakh, we'll loosely translate as the Bible, right? We have only 48 prophets. So there's so many, why only 48? Right? The ones that are included in Tanakh are the prophecies that are for all Jews for all time. Now, some of these prophets may have received a prophecy just for themselves or their family, or something to tell their neighbor, or they may very well have had something to share with all the Jewish people, but only for their time. It wasn't for Jews in the future. So these 48 prophets, they're the ones who had a prophecy that Hashem wanted that should be recorded for all Jews for all time. But back to back to what we're saying, when we had our full access to our full intellectual capabilities, we were able to tap into prophecy if we worked on ourselves and learned how to do it. Unfortunately, that was taken away, and that led to one of the other 10 changes, that prophecy stopped. Now, prophecy stopped, the prophecy called Nevuah. There's still what we probably call in prophecy, because there's not another word in English, called Ruach HaKodesh. Right? This is when you hear stories about different tzaddikim or rebbes, and they have a certain insight or they're aware of something that other people don't know. This is a Ruach HaKodesh. Again, in English, you might call it prophecy for lack of a better word. English is a limited language when it comes to spiritual concepts, but it's a much lower level than Nevuah, than what a Novi, a prophet of the Bible, had. So everyone learned the oral tradition by heart. Then what happened, as we said, destruction of the first Beis Mikdash, our das was concealed. So what happened, and it may have happened beforehand, but what officially happened is different yeshivas started keeping notes. They started keeping records of the lessons or the official teachings of their academy. And till after the destruction, before the destruction, really until a good 200 years into the second Beis Mikdash. So we're talking about, close to 300, we're going to say approximately 300 years after the destruction of the first Beis Mikdash, there were almost no disputes. In other words, the tradition was handed over clearly enough that it was clear to everyone and there was no differences of understanding. Around that time, and it had to do, with the general losing of this intellectual potential, combined with the fact that every generation goes down a step spiritually. So we've been going down, combined with we started to have persecutions from the Greeks, from the Romans, and the persecutions disrupted regular life. So people didn't have the same amount of time to spend in yeshivas, and even those who did, it wasn't the same quality because there was these upheavals. Things were unsettled. So the combination of factors led to eventually a concern that, first it led to having different views. So in the Mishnah, we start having, the Mishnah wasn't recorded yet, but in that period of time, we start having differences of opinion. Now, I will point out, there's actually only a small percentage of differences of opinion in the Talmud. Now, you might think it sounds strange because those who study Talmud, it seems to be, the majority of it seems to be differences of opinion. But that's because you only need to discuss in depth an issue that has different views. If there's something that's straightforward and clear and everyone's aware of it, then you don't need to have a discussion about it. You just state it and that's the end of the discussion, right? So even in Talmudic times where it seems like you have this view and that view and arguments and go for several pages in the Talmud, this whole difference of views and backwards and forwards, 90%, I made that number up, 90%, but I'm going to say, it's a guesstimate. I would say it's roughly correct. If it comes out 88 or 93%, it's approximate, but I would say a reasonably accurate approximate. 90% of issues, there's no argument. It's very clear. But therefore, you didn't need to have a discussion. The discussions are on the area where it wasn't clear, because we need to arrive at some type of consensus, or if we have two opinions, we have to keep challenging each one and either prove or disprove. And it might take 10 attempts to disprove or prove something. And so we have these very long discussions to get to a conclusion only in the small amount of areas where there's a difference of view or it's not clear. So what happened is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he made an official version of the Mishnah. Now the layout was prepared by Rabbi Akiva, not to be published, but sure most people are aware of Rabbi Akiva starting his academic journey at 40 years old. 40 years old, he couldn't read Hebrew, and as a 40-year-old, he was sitting with the first grade kids, sitting in class, learning the Aleph base, and eventually he became one of the greatest teachers in Jewish history. Now, in order to catch up, he was obviously a genius anyway, but in order to catch up, he started to systemize his learning. So the layout of the Talmud, the tractates, the way to break it up, that generally came from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva did that setup. That was what he used in order to be able to learn. He had, we discussed it early in the year. He had 24,000 students passed away, and he started again with 5. One of these 5 was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir took Rabbi Akiva's system and he developed it much more thoroughly, and to the point where he essentially authored the Mishnah as we have it today. And that is why a stam Mishnah, meaning there's no author, it's just a fact, with just a statement in the Mishnah, without opinions, is nearly always Rabbi Meir. In other words, he prepared it. This was his layer. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who's often called the author of the Mishnah, we could say that he was the editor, and he was the one that had the clout to be able to make an official version. Because remember, till then I said every shiva had their own notes. So we had to make one official version for all of the Jewish people, and every Jew in the world to listen to it. Right? You know how it works? 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 2 Israeli, 10 political parties. It's very difficult to get a consensus. So the great achievement of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was not that he authored the Mishnah, although he did edit it. His great achievement, was that he was able to make an authorized official version of teachings. Now, he was sort of a student of Rabbi Meir. Their lives overlap briefly, and it seems that he did study something from him in his youth, but really he learned from students of Rabbi Meir, and even some of their students. It was quite a big age difference. But he took the system and he developed it, and this became the Mishnah. Now, at that stage, the Mishnah was enough. It was the halachic oral Torah in point form. Unfortunately, after that time, talking about destruction, second base Mikdash, the Roman persecution became unbearable. Got to a point where essentially Jews could not live a normal life in Israel. Terrible, terrible times. And therefore, having this point form wasn't enough. And eventually, Ravina and Ravashi compiled all the lecture notes, all the discussions from the Talmud, that all these shivas had on the Mishnah, and they made the Gemara. They edited it, they put it together. Rabbi Yochanan did a similar job in Israel, but it finished early because the yeshivas were all closed. So we have a Talmud Yerushalmi. It really wasn't in Jerusalem, it was in the Galil, in the north of the country, generally. But the main Talmud is a Talmud Bavli from Babylon, and it went for quite a few more 100 years after the Talmud Yerushalmi. And these were all the lecture notes. It's as they were giving the classes, and the student asked a question, and they answer the question, the give and take, it was all recorded, and these were compiled, and this brought us to the Talmud. Now, there were other parts of Torah that were recorded around the same time that were written down that were oral Torah. So Kabbalistic teachings, right? We have the Zohar is recorded around the same time as the Mishnah. We have Midrashim. A lot of people think there's one body of work called the Midrash because, you have in English, the Midrash or the Midrash says. Now, there's hundreds of works of Midrashim, and some of them have a very different purposes and style. Essentially, they were the I don't like to use the word sermon. That's such a non-Jewish word, but the rabbi's sermon of the time. So some of them fill in details of the written Torah, which Hashem did not write down, but we had in an oral tradition. So some of them are those. Some teachings in Midrash are just made up parables to illustrate a point. So you have some Midrashim which are very clearly meant to be taken literally. For example, this happened to Avram when he was 15 years old, right? We got a detail that Hashem did not record in the written Torah. We know, the story with Avram and, for example, the idol store, right? We speak about Pesach every year, that his father left him in charge of the idol store. And one day, his father goes out, leaves him in charge of the shop, and a lady comes in to bring an offering. And cut a long story short, he smashes all the idols with a big axe, sort of sledgehammer type thing, except for the biggest one. And he puts it in the hand of the biggest one. And his father comes back and says, "What's going on over here? What happened?" He says, "Dad, you'll never believe it. This lady brought in food for the idols, and they were greedy. They didn't want to share, and they had a fight. And this big one here, he grabbed this big hammer, and he smashed everyone." So his father says, "Don't be ridiculous. They're made of stone and wood. They can't move. They can't talk. They can't speak. They can't eat." So he says, "Oh, so why do you pray to them then?" Right? So that's a very famous story, but that's not in the written Torah. This was part of Torah Shebaal Peh, part of the oral Torah, the oral tradition that Moshe received in the wilderness, and may very well the Jewish people have known beforehand, being the descendants of Avram. But eventually, these were recorded in Midrashim. So some Midrashim are quite obviously meant to be taken literally. Some Midrashim are quite literally not meant to be taken literally. It's a parable or a hyperbole, to show a point. And then there are some Midrashim which it's really not clear. We weren't there when the person said it, and we have it in writing, and there's no tone of voice, and perhaps it is meant to be taken literally, perhaps it isn't. So we have Midrashim, we have Kabbalistic works, as well as the Talmud, that were all sort of written down. When I say the same period, we'll say a period of about 800 years. It's eventually the written Torah was written down. So that became the Talmud. So we all started off because he had a question: is it true that we take our halachic rulings from the Shulchan Aruch and not the Talmud? So first we have to understand how the Talmud came around, and now to get the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the problem with the Talmud is that although it contains everything, but those who studied a little bit, you will notice that it's very much a class. So a student asks a question and they get an answer, and they say, "Well, might bring a proof from here." So you might be having the tractate of Shabbos that's discussing the laws of Shabbos, and to ask a question, they'll bring a law from a mezuzah. And in order to answer the question, we discuss that law. So in order to know all the laws about everything, you would have to know every single tractate. Because although the majority of laws of Shabbos are in the tractate of Shabbos, but they're also spread throughout the entire Talmud. So a few hundred years after the close of the Talmud, we had another problem. And again, this generations going down levels slowly. That was part of the issue. Another part of the issue was that people no longer spoke Aramaic, so the language became a problem. And three, the Jewish people are started to be spread throughout the world. We've got Jews in Europe, in the Middle East, and there's not this ability to be able to plumb the depths of the Talmud to truly understand it. So we had a period called the Rishonim. For example, Rashi wrote his commentaries. And again, Rashi doesn't claim to invent anything. Rashi recorded the traditions, the teachings he had from his teachers of the oral Torah. And of course, what he did invent was I won't say invent per se, but his achievement was his ability to write so clearly and concisely and on everything. But the Rambam was probably the next stage in the development of halacha. So the Rambam, he codified the Talmud. So he said, now we're going to have a book called the Laws of Shabbos. And in the Laws of Shabbos, we're going to have a chapter called the Laws of Kiddush. And this chapter is going to first give over the basic principles, and it's going to go through all the laws in order. And he codified essentially the entire oral Torah, all the halachas, all the law, according to his view, and that became the Mishnah Torah. Right? The Rambam wrote many books, but this was the Mishnah Torah. Often we just call it the Rambam. 14 books, 14 volumes that have, and it goes through every law, both those that are relevant today and those that won't be relevant until Mashiach comes, like the sacrifices and the Beis Mikdash, various things. Other people did similar things. So the Rif, he didn't codify it the same way. What he did is he rewrote the Talmud, but he left out anything that he didn't feel was halacha. So it's like so you don't have the whole discussions, you just have the views. Then along came the Tur. So the Tur, he wrote, called the Tur Shulchan Aruch. It's the layout of our Shulchan Aruch, of the full code of Jewish law. He used that system. He made that system. And again, he codified, and so that's what happened. Now, amongst these Rishonim who codified things, again, we have different views on which, perhaps, which view in the Talmud we accept, or how we explain what they mean. And as well as that, we also start to have a difference of custom developing from Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and we ended up, again, what happens is that Jews became spread throughout the world. So a Jew in Germany would not have any contact with a Jew in Yemen. And they didn't have emails or telephones. And all it needed was one slight different ruling on one area. And the chain effect is that 50 years later, you have a significant different view on something. So this ended up, that was when the Shulchan Aruch came. So the Beis Yosef, who had written a commentary on the Tur and the Rambam, he made a summary of these commentaries, and he called it the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means the set table. He wanted people, if they want to look up a halacha, the same way when you sit down at a table that's set, you can just eat. You don't have to prepare anything. It's all set and done already. He wanted to make a system where you can just look something up and it's there. And he did that whenever there was a difference of view amongst the earliest scholars. He looked at what he felt were the three main ones, the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh, and he went how the majority of those two ruled, if there was difference of opinion. Now, the Rif and the Rambam was Sfardim, and the Rosh was an Ashkenazi. So sometimes a ruling where we have different view. Now, I don't want people to get too concerned that there's huge differences in Judaism between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. It's not. And some of them are actually facts on the ground. So for an example, I think I shared the story before. There was a man who came to the Baal Shem Tov with a certain lung disease. And the doctors told him that he can't live. He's not going to be able to live. He's not going to survive. So he came to the Baal Shem Tov for a blessing. The Baal Shem Tov told him to move to Israel. So the students asked, how? How's that going to help? So he says that in Poland, we rule like the Ramal, the Ashkenazi codifier. And he says that an animal with this lung disease will not survive 12 months. But the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch, who his view is accepted at that time as a primary view in Israel, he rules that the animal will survive. And so if he moves there, he goes under his halachic authority and he can survive. Now, although that might be true on a spiritual level as well, but often facts on the ground. I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. There's certain lung diseases that a cold Eastern European damp winter, the animal's not going to survive. In a Mediterranean climate, it will. It's not necessarily they have a different view. For example, you see there's different views amongst scholars of that period also about the length of twilight, the twilight period between sunset and nightfall. But again, it's facts on the ground. We see you go to different parts of the world and twilight lasts for different lengths of time. They were discussing the reality of the place where they lived. So this is really how Shulchan Aruch developed. So it ended up, to a large extent, being the final opinion. Now, of course, then there became commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, right? And today we have. It can sometimes be difficult to rule directly from Shulchan Aruch as well. A person needs to. That's why we have rabbis today. People who have studied in depth and have studied from those who experienced. It's called shimush, like an apprenticeship. They spend time with someone who's experienced in ruling and see how they rule and not only what they rule in certain things, but how they come to that, so they can learn these things, and that's. So that's why when we say you can't really rule from the Talmud, because you can have a view here, but there might be a statement in a different tractate that says differently, right? But the Shulchan Aruch, which is the bottom line after it's all been debated, that we can rule on. Okay, was that a short answer to your question? That's a good Jewish answer. Well, actually we have to, it's like the person asked the rabbi, says, I'm coming to think in the Talmud, they just answer questions with more questions. So the rabbi says, why do you say that? Anyway.
What's wrong with that?
Chapter 96. Number 15.
In my other shir with Rabbi Shapiro, we're doing Masechtas Megillah, Gemara Megillah, where it talks about how Talmus took 72 heads and put them into separate rooms and said, here's your Torah. Give me a Greek translation. And each of the 72 were isolated, and each came up with the exact same translation, including 15 changes that they made to the text so as not to upset him. He should get a wrong idea, whatever it was. I was on behalf of Klal Yisrael. But it was a big miracle that 72 rabbis in 72 separate rooms went through all the 5 Chumashim and came up with the exact same translation in Greek, except for these 15, including these 15 changes. Rabbi Shapiro said, you want to know what a bigger miracle would have been? If you put the 72 rabbis in one room and have them agree on a translation to the Greek. So I just thought it was alongside with what you were saying. So,
yeah. Now, although we do make those jokes, but the reality is, like we said, everyone agrees on far more than they disagree. You know, and it's often there's too much focus on what people disagree on. You know, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, he was the head of YU, Yeshiva University, for many years. His PhD thesis, he compared the works of the Volozhiner, who was the primary student of the Vilna Gaon, and the works of the Balatanya, the Alter Rebbe, say he was one of the primary student of the Maggid Mezrich, and he analyzed all their teachings, and he came out that they agree on 98 point something %. And even what they didn't agree on, I think was something, I don't remember the exact number now, but it was something like 80%. It was a difference of nuance. No, it's where's the emphasis? It wasn't a disagreement on the underlying ideas. So, at that time in history, there was a rather large rift, and everyone focused on the differences, and it split Jewry to many Jewish communities to a large extent. But you see, they agreed on nearly everything. So it's very important to make sure that we focus on all the things we do agree on, and try not to spend too much focus on what we don't agree on. And I think even what we don't agree on, more often than not, we should happily agree to disagree. Now, that's when it comes from Torah, right? When we have things, the certain ideas in the world, and even in some movements that claim to be Jewish, that really the antithesis of Torah. So, you can still disagree respectfully while firmly. You can still be nice about it. Doesn't mean we have to, start bringing venom into dialogue, and you attack ideas, don't necessarily have to attack the person. But when it comes from we'll call it, so to speak, another Torah camp, I think we have to focus on what we do agree, and leave alone what we don't. Okay, chapter 96, number 15, our Grand Siyum. So who actually started the Hilchos Shabbos from the beginning? Who's still part of the Shir? So got David. I think Ben, did you also start? Anyway, I think he's nodding. And all right, so this is truly an accomplishment. Those who started in between somewhere, it's also accomplishment. Those start right at the beginning. So when did you start? Like 2 years ago. More. I've been giving this class for over a year and a quarter. It was quite a way in. So it must be more than 2 years. So we'll have to give a big mazel tov to those who have finished. Number 15. Shachach or nenes or hazid ulo hivdil matzah Shabbos. A person did not make havdalah on Saturday night. Now, it could be beyond his control. You know, God forbid to rush someone to the hospital, or there was no wine. Right? There was a prohibition era. The smugglers didn't arrive yet. Whatever it was. So there was could have been beyond his control, or he forgot. He just forgot. You know, fell asleep, whatever it is. Or even if he deliberately, God forbid, didn't make havdalah. Any of these cases, doesn't matter why, in other words, if he didn't make havdalah on Saturday night, yachol lahavdil at soif yom hashlishi. He has until sunset on Tuesday. Now, obviously, the sooner the better, and we shouldn't think that now we have a license, oh, it's more convenient, let's do havdalah tomorrow. Havdalah has to be done Saturday night. We're just saying if it didn't happen, then until Tuesday, he can do this. Avol, however, lo yavarech lo al basamim v'lo al ner. When you make not Saturday night, when it's not Saturday night, there's no blessing said on the spices and no blessing said on the candle. Because as we explained earlier, the spices is because, you know, Shabbos has just ended, and it's to, you know, make us feel a bit happier. And, well, if we do it on Sunday or Monday, Shabbos didn't just end, you know, we're over it already. The candle, as we mentioned, on the first Saturday night of creation, Adam he got kicked out of the Garden of Eden on the Friday, and that Saturday night was the first fire, and he saw the fire reflecting his nails. Oh, and that reminded him. And so, again, that's only relevant to Saturday night. So if it happens to be we weren't able to make havdalah on Saturday night, we're making it on Sunday or Monday or even Tuesday, we don't make a blessing on the spices or the candle. Rak, birchas brei gofen, the birchas mavdil. We just make a bracha on the wine and the main body of the havdalah, the bracha of a mavdil mekadosh l'chol. So that's till sunset on Tuesday. Once Tuesday is finished, because remember in halacha, Tuesday night is Wednesday, right? The Jewish day begins with the evening. So once Tuesday is finished, which is sunset on Tuesday, you can't make havdalah anymore. Why? Why could you keep making after Saturday night for another few days? Because the first 3 days of the week are called the days after Shabbos. You say to someone, oh, I'm going to do it after Shabbos. Or you speak about after Shabbos. So the Sunday, Monday, and even Tuesday is still called the days that followed Shabbos. It's a Shabbos, and therefore they're like a continuation of the Saturday night. But the next 3 days, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they're called the days before Shabbos. Right? Friday is not the day after the last Shabbos, it's the day before the next Shabbos. And same with Thursday and Wednesday. Then they're in the Shabbos Sha'avra, and they are no longer connected to the Shabbos that preceded it. Well, Mazel Tov to those who finished all the laws of Shabbos. Now, today posted there may be an option to do a test, and and get tested and get a certificate that you mastered Hilchos Shabbos. But whether it comes out or not, and if it does come out, whether you do it or not, Mazel Tov and a tremendous completion. It's a big chunk. It's really a big chunk, and all those who joined at a certain point, Mazel Tov to you for what you did do. You know, when we finish reading a book of the Torah, we say Chazak, Chazak, v'nis Chazak. You know, we say be strong, be strengthened. So it seems odd. Normally, you would think, when should you give someone's encouragement to be strong? before you start an undertaking. Because you've got this huge undertaking to accomplish, that's when you should bless them, be strong. After they finished already, it seems an odd choice of where to bless people. But one of the lessons we see is that when we finish something significant, to be able to get ourselves into the next thing with the same drive can sometimes be very difficult. So it's precisely at the siyum, at the completion of a book of the Torah, before we start the next one, we wish each other to be strong, to be dedicated. So although it's not one of the 5 books of the Torah that we just finished, but no, we finished the laws of Shabbos. So chazak, v'nis chazak. Everyone should be ready for the next one. Chapter 121. Now, those who have the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch in a few volumes, or more than one volume, may need to quickly change books. But chapter 121. So it's the laws of a public fast day. And it's a good introduction to the next few chapters, which speak about a period of time in the Jewish calendar called the 3 weeks. Right? It's called the 3 weeks. And coincidentally, it lasts for 3 weeks. Well, actually 3 weeks and 1 day. And part of those 3 weeks is a period of time called the 9 days, which coincidentally lasts for 9 days. And it's a time in the Jewish calendar where, I'm not going to say it's a sad time per se, but it's a less happy time. When Purim comes, the month of Adar, it says, "Mishnichnas Adar marbem b'simcha." When the month of Adar begins, we have to increase in happiness. And maybe someone can hear my grandson in the background. He wants to join the shir. He's here too. So, when Adar begins, we increase in joy, which, by the way, doesn't mean we start being joyous, we increase. So we have to be happy to start with, right? A Jew always has to be full of joy. You can only serve Hashem with joy. And so tongue-in-cheek, and I may have shared this before, the question was asked seriously. The students asked the famous Mashpia, about 100 years ago, how do you do that? How do every day you increase in joy? So he tongue-in-cheek answers them. This is not the real answer. It's just what he said. Told them as tongue-in-cheek was the first day of Adar you have 1 l'chaim. The second day of Adar you have 2 l'chaims, and so on and so forth. Which is become really interesting in a Jewish leap year, where we have 60 days of Adar. Right? But anyway, so they said to him, okay. So they played along. It also says, Mishnichnas Av, when Av begins, Ma'atim b'simcha, we decrease in simcha. Right? That 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av. And again, I want to point out, it doesn't say you become depressed, and it says you lessen your simcha, you lessen your joy. You have less. We still have to serve Hashem with happiness. So it says, then you start the month with 30 l'chaims. Second day you have 29, right? So, and again, please don't try that at home. Those programs, they say, do not try this at home. We don't recommend this. But I just mentioned this idea that, yes, we are sad, particularly on Tisha B'Av itself, but it's not depression. Right? There's 2 types, just to give an introduction, there's 2 types of sadness. You can have a person who realizes they missed out on something. They're sad about it. And this then motivates them, you know what? If I don't want to miss out again, I have to change something. Because if we just keep doing the same thing, we can't expect different results. So one type of sadness / disappointment leads to positive change. That's what the 9 days and Tisha B'Av is about. A sadness of depression, again, I'm not talking about clinical depression that people need help with. You can't just say to someone, snap out of it. That's actually just makes people feel worse. It makes it worse because you're implying they should have control over things which at the moment they don't have control. But so I'm not talking about a clinical depression. I'm talking about just, let's say, a regular depression, if that's the right way to word it. When a person is, right, depression generally is negative. In other words, it paralyzes the person. The person is now withdraws, and they don't have energy to make change. So there's two types of sadness. There's a sadness that leads to wanting to make something different, and that's a positive sadness, and that's something that we have a place for it in Judaism. It doesn't mean it's what we do all day, every day, but there's a place for it. And these 9 days that we're going to, when we get up to there, we'll see that's the place, or one of the places. But a type of sadness that paralyzes us, that stops us from doing things, then that's no good. We have to snap out of it, or if it's the again, we're talking about not a clinical depression. The person is able to be on their own to get out of it. But someone is in a situation when they need help, and again, no one should ever be ashamed to go for help. It's ironic. No one feels embarrassed to go to a doctor for a broken leg or various things. But sometimes when it's mental health or emotional health, people feel embarrassed, and we shouldn't be. Right? It's our health and our well-being, and we need to be. If we want to be the best Jew that we can be, want to be the most spiritual, most connected to Hashem, we have to be physically, emotionally, and mentally the top of our game. So that's all right.